Okay. I'd like to call the work study session to order. City Clerk, may I have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Meyer?
Here.
Oh, here. Mayor Pro Tem Krupa?
Here.
Mayor Brown?
Here. Moving on to public comment period. At this time, members of the public may only comment on an item appearing on the study session agenda. We have 4 items, 4A, 4B, and 4C. Review of penalties for fireworks, animal control regulations for businesses, and street vendor permit regulations and enforcement. And please adhere to the following when addressing the council. Comments are limited to 2 minutes or less, and council comments should be directed to council as a whole and not individual council members. And remember to follow the adopted rules of decorum, resolution number 4545. Do we have any e-comments submitted for the study session?
No, Mayor Brown, there were no e-comments submitted for the study session.
Do we have anyone on the teleconference for comments?
No, Mayor, there are no members of the public on the line.
Okay, and no speaker slips?
Correct, I have not received any requests to speak from members present.
Okay, then we will turn it over to, did you want to make any comments first? Eric?
No, I think we'll just roll right into it.
Okay.
We're going to try to move through this a little quicker than we did last time and give you plenty of time to dialogue on the street vendor issue.
Okay, well, welcome. Al?
So much. I appreciate it. Good to be back. This is a continuation from the presentation that we were doing last time on community concerns. Because the council has had this for about a month, and because we've got 3 items that we want to get through, I am going to try to move a little faster and really get to some of the questions that I think that you have. That's going to become probably critical when we get to the animal control part. Although we focused this presentation originally on sentry and guard dogs, the mayor did let us know that Councilmember Meyer's question was a little bit different, and so I'm going to address that once we get to that part, and we can skip through the sentry part, other than saying things that we think needs to be changed. So I'm going to start off by talking about fireworks, and like I said, I'm going to go through this a little bit quickly. The state fireworks law is found in the California Health and Safety Code, and the takeaway here is that although the state has essentially set forth a guideline and a regulation thoroughly, it still contemplates that the state law can be supplemented by local law. So Hemet still has the ability to regulate fireworks. It does, in fact, regulate fireworks. And specifically, it can regulate really just going to be the misdemeanor part. So under the state law, you've got misdemeanors and felonies. The state gets to charge, and so does Hemet as a local entity. It could charge up to a year in jail or a fine of $1,000. The state gets to go a little bit further. They get to prosecute to a time up to 3 years in state prison and fines as high as $50,000. So that's going to be the big difference penalty-wise between what the state can do and what Hemet locally can do. The state fireworks law does divide fireworks into 2 categories. Fireworks they call dangerous, which are going to be always illegal, and fireworks which are going to be safe and sane. As I stated earlier, a city can enact ordinance regulating or even banning fireworks, which is what the city does, as long as that ban does not conflict with what the state law says, because state law is going to preempt local laws. And we just had a brief definition of what it means by conflict, and it conflicts if essentially the ordinance is going to be contradictory or enters an area that is expressly or impliedly fully occupied by the state law. So again, you can enact an ordinance making it unlawful for any person to sell, use, or discharge any fireworks that are not exempt. And what I mean by exempt is that the state lists certain rules or that are safe and sane with exceptions. Hemet does list those exceptions within its own ordinance already. So for instance, if you had a request for a permit for agriculture and wildlife, because that's in the state law, those individuals get to use fireworks. Similarly, the military, railroads, and religious organizations, there's a permitting process that they actually have to apply, and if that's granted, then they get to use the fireworks in that capacity. So we don't outright ban it because we have those few sort of exceptions. If a city does enact an ordinance regulating fireworks or its limits, you can impose an administrative fine pursuant to the government code, and you can do it up to $1,000 for each violation. Because the Hemet Code has that each violation can be a continuing violation, you can essentially charge $1,000 multiple times if they continue to use the fireworks on any particular occasion. So, again, Hemet's Code walks through it. I think it's pretty conclusive. It doesn't conflict with the state law. The police department has compiled data related to fireworks for the last 2 years. What they've seen is that they've made 3 arrests. They've issued 67 citations. Not surprisingly, because of the 4th of July, in both years, almost all of the citations and arrests occurred in the month of July. When we looked at anything that could be changed, what we saw is that Hemet didn't choose to impose the maximum fine that you could for fireworks. So, and as we go to the other side, you'll see that a lot of cities are. Because the state law allows you to go up to $1,000, because that's what the misdemeanor penalty could be. Yeah, our recommendation is probably that you go up to that maximum amount. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to impose it, but you have the option of choosing whether you're going to impose the $1,000. And that's the only recommendation that we have related to the fireworks ordinance. And again, we just put what some of the other cities are doing. Temecula's got $1,000, very similar to Hemet's. Riverside, same thing, fine of $1,000. So if the city's going to make any change, it would be to increase that fine. Animal control is the next topic. Briefly, animal control relates to the control, care, feeding, and impoundment, and sometimes even the disposition of animals within the city's boundaries. Hemet has codes reflecting its adopted ordinance to regulate those, and all of those are found in Chapter 10. The city also contracts with the Ramona Humane Society, who essentially serve as animal control officers for the city. As I stated originally, I planned on what we thought the topic was going to be was the regulation of sort of sentry or guard dogs, but that's not really it. The city, just so you know though, in case we do want to make any changes to that, the city doesn't have a plethora of codes sort of regulating sentry or guard dogs. In fact, there's only 2 small sections within that entire Chapter 10 that even talks about sentry dogs. And all they state is if you have a sentry dog on your property, you have to have a sign, and that a person who has a sentry dog can't stop animal control for asking for a license. The state law is a lot more comprehensive. It talks about regulation, how many you can have, how they need to be trained. So that's one of the areas that briefly we did talk about, and again, it's found in the Health and Safety Code. The city might want to consider adding to Chapter 10 so that it is kind of more comprehensive of really what you want to do related to those types of dogs. But, and correct me if I'm wrong, Councilmember Meyer, my understanding is that your question related to also issues that may have arisen related to unlicensed facilities or businesses in the city, or businesses that are improperly operating that board, sell, and care for dogs. Is that correct? So the city does have codes related to that already, which is a great thing. So there's not really any recommendations that I'm going to make towards changing. Enforcement is going to be probably what we're going to need to focus on a little bit more. So again, it's all found in Chapter 10, but specifically Chapter 10-35 deals with kennels and pet shops. And it broadly, 10-31 broadly defines what a kennel or a pet shop is. And that is any facility that keeps dogs for any purpose. So obviously that would apply to a facility that cared for dogs in any way, or those facilities that sell and maintain dogs. What it says in Section A of 1035 is that a license is always required. So to the extent that there's any facility that's operating without a license, the city has the ability to essentially crack down on those particular operations. Right now, looking at what the penalties could be for operating, in Section 10-48, they only make an infraction, which is still a criminal penalty, but it's not as high as a misdemeanor penalty, but they can be charged with an infraction, or you could always go back to Section 1, which is the general code dealing with penalties, and you can impose an administrative citation and fine related to any violations of that code. Also, each one of those facilities are subject to an inspection, so that at any point if there's a question regarding their license, or, like you said, if there's a question regarding whether these businesses are operating improperly, the Ramona Animal Control does have the authority under the code to walk in and essentially say, we want to inspect this facility to make sure that you're complying with all of the rules that are within the code. And those rules are outlined in 1035 Section C, and it talks about, making sure that they're always healthy and sanitary, that they've got enough food and water, that there's adequate control of any insects or rodents that can be in those type of facilities, and just a plethora of other things. I think there's like 8 or 9 different sections that it outlines that each one of those facilities would have to comply with. So to the extent that they're not complying with any of that, we can walk in and say that we want to inspect. If they deny the inspection or say, we refuse to allow you to do it, then we would do what we would normally do under those circumstances, which is request an inspection warrant from the court, which gives us an order to actually go in, and then you can take more aggressive action with respect to what they're doing at those particular facilities. So I don't know if that answers the question that you had.
The specific scenario, there was a business owner that rented an office space. They ended up, and it was not for the carrying of animals, right? It was, it could have been like grooming or something like that. And they ended up having puppies in the place and leaving them all night unattended and that type of stuff. So what does that fall under?
I think that absolutely falls under the same section, because the definition of kennel and the definition of pet shop is broad enough to encompass even that situation, because it says any facility that even houses the dogs. So because at that point they would be housing them, they would be required to have a license if that's what they're doing. You're not talking about an individual resident who just has a couple of dogs at their house. Even if a resident had a couple of dogs at their house, if they go over a particular amount, they also have to get licenses. So in that particular situation that you described, they would actually absolutely could be regulated, should be regulated under the code. And, if they are improperly caring for those dogs, then the animal control officer that we contract out with probably wants to start enforcing, those provisions.
And Al, let me add it, in that circumstance, in addition to a fine or a penalty, we could also seek an injunction or temporary restraining order given the circumstances.
And that's I appreciate you bringing that up, Eric, because that's another thing that we do, and I know you probably recall we did that a lot with the marijuana cases when we saw that people were improperly operating those facilities, operating, because Hemet doesn't have a licensing scheme for that. So in those particular instances, it's a little bit longer of a process than just going through it administratively, and it may cost a bit more, but you do have the ability to file a civil, what it is a civil complaint with the Superior Court of California, and you're asking for an injunction. And it's going to be a 2-step process, essentially. The first one is going to be where they probably issue a temporary restraining order to give the other party, the ability to come in and contest it. And then the longer one, if the judge actually grants it based on the evidence that's presented. So that is always an option that the city has if it wants to go down that route. And you could get it as tough or as lenient as possible, right? As part of those injunctions, you could ask that this individual never operate or be allowed to have a certain amount of dogs again. So you do have some options as it relates to that.
And that authority also gives you the opportunity, if there's concerns about animal cruelty or maltreatment, you can always, up the ante, so to speak, by alleging other offenses
Absolutely.
Related to animal care. Or
a lot of times when you actually do the inspections, you will find, those other things that you mentioned. And so I think in all of these cases, the inspection is probably the biggest thing up front, because just like I said, we find either in the massage parlors or in the marijuana facilities, once you go to these places and actually do the inspection, you're likely to find, different violations than just the ones you were originally going there for. So the city does have that ability right now.
Before we move out of animal control, I'd like to ask our police chief if he has any thoughts on the sentry dog issue. Since our municipal code is relatively silent on that, do you know historically have we had concerns about businesses having sentry dogs, and whether there's any need for some regulation on that?
Since I've been here, we haven't had any issues that I could recall, except for a couple that was mentioned, I think it was previous year or this year.
Okay, appreciate that. I know that one city that I used to work for, there was a large industrial park and a business that had frequent false alarms. We had a routine for that required you to climb over a fence to actually check the building structure, and they ended up bringing in some Doberman guard dogs, but they neglected to let the police department know.
Gotcha.
So it ended up in a real tragic situation where an officer responding to an alarm was attacked by one of the dogs, and he wasn't injured, but he had to shoot the dog. And so that situation, I'm just thinking that if we were to have something that required them to notify the police department if they're going to deploy those dogs, would be very important for officer safety.
And that's exactly what the state law would require, you know, if we adopted something similar. That if you have those kind of dogs on your property, you've got to let either, I think it's the police chief or the city clerk know, because it has to be maintained and you're documented. Even if you sell them, you have to let them know who you're selling it to, so that they're always aware of where those dogs are going. So I do think it's a good idea just because of that. You know, we always say we never think about needing these laws until something happens, right? And so this may be one of those situations where it doesn't really hurt to put it in there, and then if something comes up, we actually have the laws to use.
I just think it's good food for thought for us to think about.
I have one more animal thing to discuss since this is on our agenda, but during COVID, it seems that our animal shelter is staffed less, our service that we're paying for. So, and my concern is they may be staffed less, but animals don't stop getting lost because there is a pandemic going on. And so we're finding more and more people housing more and more animals on their private property because the service in our city isn't being performed. So that's kind of something that we're going to need to probably address at some point, but so it's on our radar.
Good thought.
Well, the last topic is sidewalk vending. And I know that we may have a little bit more discussion, so I wanted to start off with what sidewalk vending is. Sidewalk vendor is a person who sells food or merchandise from a push cart, stand, display, pedal-driven cart, wagon, showcase rack, or other non-motorized conveyance. And it talks about from one's person or upon the sidewalk. And I know that Mayor Pro Tem Krupa, that I think one of the questions you had related to mobile, essentially mobile food, I don't want to call them carts because they're not carts, but mobile food vending is a good way to describe that. And that is regulated under a different section in the HEMIT code than sidewalk vending. So those are, just so you know, and I can answer any questions you have related to that. That wasn't in the original sidewalk vending presentation that we did. But the sidewalk vending state law that came down that essentially had us modify the way we look at sidewalk vending is going to be different than the mobile vending ordinances that we have on the books. Because the state law and the municipal code, in this section anyway, that deals with sidewalk vending is only going to relate to the non-motorized. The motorized you can regulate differently, and we do regulate that differently in a separate part of the code. So with having the definition, what are some of the concerns that sort of, at least we've heard that has come up? There are concerns with the sidewalk vendors blocking the streets. In some circumstances, if they're in the streets, there's a concern that maybe you can have some backed up traffic. If you have, just like any other restaurant, a lot of people who are lining up, you may have noise issues. You do have the ability, obviously, to regulate out of residential areas. We can talk about that in a second. But and unsanitary conditions is another one, and you have the ability to regulate that too. For instance, you can make it mandatory that there are trash receptacles outside the vending so that you can encompass some of the concerns related to the sanitary conditions. SB 946 is the law that kind of came down, the state law. It's the Safe Sidewalk Vending Act. And what it did was establish requirements for any local regulation of sidewalk vending. That's tough as a local entity, because what it did is take a lot of authority out of the hands of the local entity and set up a framework from the state of what the local entity can do. And really, one of the biggest changes that you see is that it prohibited all criminal penalties for sidewalk vending violations, and allows anyone that was previously prosecuted or convicted related to sidewalk vending to have those the prosecution, sentence, fine, or conviction essentially dismissed and removed from their record. That went into effect in January of 2019. I know that the city worked with Mr. Vail and also Stephanie Gutierrez to modify the city's code following the Senate bill that, prior to it going into effect, but after the city knew that it was going to go into effect. And in doing so, what we attempted to do was to impose as much regulation as possible while still ensuring that the city was compliant with what the state requirements are. So what are the California law limitations? Well, any sidewalk vending regulations that a local entity imposes as part of their ordinance must comply with specific standards, and those standards are generally going to be related to limitations on location. So I've got, when you see on some of these slides, I'm going to say what you can't do, but in the bottom I'm going to say how you can maybe get around that. So up front, what the law says is that you generally cannot require a sidewalk vendor to operate within specific parts of the right-of-way. But you can require them to operate within specific right-of-ways if the city has a concern, an objective concern, that there are health, safety, or welfare issues dealing with where they're located. So, for instance, let's say you've got a sidewalk, and I know this may even be one of the questions that was brought up last time. You've got a bunch of, or a vendor, and you've also got buildings or restaurants that have entrances. And there's a concern that, a particular vendor is maybe popular, and all of a sudden people are lining up on the streets so that individuals can't walk down the street, or there's the worry that they're going to have problems entering into these buildings. Well, because of that, you can regulate the time, place, and manner of where those vendors are located, and that's exactly what the code does right now. So Hemet's code actually gives the city the ability to set distances from, other buildings that the sidewalk vendors can be. And one of the ones I noted is that a sidewalk vendor cannot be within 25 feet of an entrance or exit to any building, structure, or facility. They also can't be within 200 feet of a police station, fire station, Hemet City Hall, or the Hemet Public Library. Similarly, they can't be within 100 feet of another sidewalk vendor. In other words, we're not trying to have it compact, or a public or private school. So that's some of the regulations that the city has already put in place because of the health, safety, or welfare concerns that it has. Another thing that the California law, another limitation that it places, is that you generally can't require a sidewalk vendor to operate within specific parts. Oh, we've already mentioned this. You can't prohibit a sidewalk vendor from selling food or merchandise in a park owned or operated by the local authority. But again, there's that caveat. So you can do that, and you can prohibit the stationary vendors from operating if the city already has an existing exclusive agreement for concessions with another group. Or if you have a special event that's going on, you can regulate at that point, and you can say, hey, you can't operate within this park because we have a particular event. So again, we've got these regulations, but there's also these caveats that go along with every one of them. You cannot restrict the sidewalk vendors to designated neighborhoods or areas, except when it's directly related to objective health and safety concerns. But what you can do is prohibit the stationary sidewalk vendors in areas that are exclusively zoned residential, and that's what I mentioned earlier, or where you already prohibit any commercial activity. Another limitation is that the city cannot require a sidewalk vendor to obtain the consent or approval of any non-governmental entity or individual, such as a nearby business, before the vendor can sell food or merchandise. And the idea there is that while we can regulate for health, safety, and welfare concerns, the law is expressly clear that you can't regulate competition out. And so They have that as its own enumerated section within the state law, so that's one of the things we can't do. But again, if there's these health and safety concerns, because of the location of a vendor to the entrance of a building, you still have the ability to regulate that way.
Question on that specific. Say, for example, a sidewalk vendor sets up selling tacos, and they're set up in front of a Mexican restaurant. Is that prohibition that you just described there prevent us from saying you can't be here because you're competing with the same kind of food provider?
So that would be one of the situations where you couldn't regulate solely for the purpose of competition. So it's actually in Government Code Section 51038, and I'll read to you what it says. It says, for purposes of this section, perceived community animus or economic competition does not constitute an objective health, safety, or welfare concern. So, in that particular situation, unless there was a health and safety concern, and, one of the examples that I brought up was if you've got a particularly popular either restaurant or popular sidewalk vendor where you're concerned about traffic along the street, that would be the means to regulate it there, but you couldn't just regulate it because of economic concerns, because of the state law limitations. And this is one of the things we mentioned before. You can impose reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions on sidewalk vendors. The city already does that within its code. And, this is just, I'm not going to go through all of them, but I provided a list of examples of what is considered reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions. And so you can have limitations on the hours. You can require that they have safety, maintain safety conditions. You can require permits. All of those things are reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions that the city can actually impose. The city actually, did this. Like I said, it followed the law once before it was changed so that we could be in compliance once January 2019 went into play. We implemented a permitting scheme for sidewalk vendors. We outlined the regulations that were necessary, and the city also set forth a suspension, denial, revocation, and appeal process. Because what you can do is, even though they have the ability to operate, they have to get a license from the local entity, and the city has the ability to revoke it if they're not in compliance with the rules that the city has already set forward. As a result, we've got no recommended changes because, again, you just did this not too long ago. There's nothing that I see right now within the code that I would change that's inconsistent with the way the state law is written.
As far as the licensing, is there any requirement for them having to display all of their licenses? Or so if I walk up to a sidewalk vendor, I can see that they have a city business license, that they have a seller's resale permit, that they have a health certificate, any of those things that they have to physically have them showing?
See, and I didn't look up that, and I can find out that answer for you
Okay.
and respond to it, because I know in some of the other facilities, like in the massage parlors, that's a requirement, where they have to actually post it. I'm not sure if that's a requirement, but I will look that up and provide you with an
Any other
answer.
business in town has
Absolutely.
to display all of their licenses
Right.
so that you can see them.
And I know they have to have the license. It's the display I'm not sure about, but I'll find out. And if it's not mentioned in the state law, then it's clearly not one of those things that's prohibited. So even if it's not expressly written, that may be something that we're able to add to the Hemet Municipal Code.
I would think that that's something that we should definitely look at and consider adding if we don't have it. Carl?
So you're saying that those three things are required for our codes right now?
Which three?
The health department
Yes,
certificate, the business license, and the reseller's
that
permit?
is correct.
And so what we find is our street vendors wait until City Hall is closed, which is 1 o'clock now,
Correct.
and so they have all day to sell and do things. And if they don't have the license from the health department, how are we enforcing that? That's not our license. But that's a big deal.
Yeah, and if they don't have one of those licenses, then they don't have the complete licensing scheme that's required under the city's code. So essentially, we can tell them that you can't operate,
Who's going to be the teller? That's what I'm asking.
I would imagine it was either code enforcement or the police department. we have the ability to, because we have a framework for penalties associated with not complying with that portion of the code. As a matter of fact, it's an escalating penalty scheme. The only thing that the state law says is that you can't criminally penalize them, but it says nothing about your ability to issue fines. So the city does have an escalating fine structure for violations of the code.
And then, thinking about it like operationally, that's surely other cities don't put that on their police department, right? Because we have crimes going on.
Yeah.
And so at the level of
and I've actually seen both, to be honest. You're absolutely right, is that, you want your city police usually to
right,
focus a
because
little
now
bit more.
we'll call them for dogs and we'll call them for all
Agreed.
kinds of things that
And
are not in the
code
scope.
enforcement is usually going to be the group that's dealing with it, but code is going to deal with some unique, probably situations that maybe the police department wouldn't. So, for instance, the police can maybe demand, like ID and different things that code may not have the ability to do. So, depending on the circumstance, I have seen in certain cities that we work with that the police department goes to assist code with certain calls that they deal with. Mostly it's code enforcement, but the police department does get involved. And you're right, it does take them away from those other things, but it's one of those prioritizing of, city council has to kind of decide where we're going to put those resources to sort of deal with some of these issues.
Thanks, Sal. The comment that I have is, I understand what the intent of the legislation is, because it's gotten so expensive to open a business in California, and this is an avenue for people that are less fortunate to be able to, as the words of the legislators, have that entrepreneurial spirit.
Right.
So I get that. However, it doesn't weigh very well with the businesses that go through the proper procedures and spend countless hours and sometimes endless amounts of money to open up a business, and for street vendors to come in and just set up shop anywhere and not have to comply and pay the fees and that of our local businesses who are actually contributing to our economy. These street vendors, they're skating on sales tax that now the city's losing out on, versus the brick and mortar that is collecting that sales tax. Same thing with the food vendors. When you go to a fast food, or when you go to a restaurant, you pay sales tax on that food, and that's sales tax revenue that the city's losing out on. So they're skating out on that, and then the cost of their licensing and permits are, from my experience, real cheap compared to other businesses that open up in the city. And so they're getting by on that, and then they're not held to the same standards as the businesses that have to open their doors every day. And now our businesses are being shut down in light of COVID, where the street vendors can just pop up all over. I'm getting complaints all over the place. I'm getting calls weekly about this, and it's, I always tell my kids, the fair's in Paris, but it's one of those things. It's not fair to our local businesses who go through the permitting process and go through the process to open up a business and then pay the sales taxes that, they pay. I think that that there might need to be some changes made to our ordinance, as far as the fine structure, as far as the permitting structure, and then as far as some other time, place, and manner locations. The police maybe need to be tightened up. I know for a fact that these street vendors are out there, they're not in compliance with the code now, and it's not being enforced. And so the question is then, how do we go about? I know that as the comments were made, our police department's burdened with criminal activity, and our code enforcement's doing code enforcement.
Right.
But this is one section of the code they're not out there enforcing.
Right.
Because if they were, they would be writing citations daily. So it's one of those things. We can have ordinances this much, this many, and this big, and if we don't have the mechanism to enforce those ordinances, then why are we making ordinances?
Mayor and council members, it's very much in the implementation. Specifically, the ordinance under operating requirements allows the director to set operating times for the street vendors, and they have to comply with that, and they can set special times within residential areas. There was a question earlier about the prominent display of permits. Section 18-484, that's all of the operating permits. Paragraph A specifically requires the cart to have all of the necessary licenses and prominently display them. And so if there's a cart out that's not prominently displaying its food permit, its city license, then it's operating inconsistent and outside of our ordinance and can be fined.
Does that apply to flower vendors and knick-knack vendors and all of those other things, that they have to at least have a city license and a resale number?
Yeah, every business in the city should have at least a business license. The question about, I believe that mobile cart vendor under our definition of the ordinance isn't just related to food. It's related to anybody selling anything by a mobile push cart. And so even if it were flowers, or we had the issue with phones and things like that, you're still a street vendor, you still have to get a license. If there are health licenses that you have to get, you have to have one. We'd have to check with the county to see if there's a health license that you have to obtain for flowers.
Yeah, and that falls under the definition section that Eric's talking about. We define food, but we also include goods and merchandise. Well, the city includes goods and merchandise as one of the things that's regulated.
And I was going to go into and Eric kind of touched on it about the licensing. I think that there's been maybe some issues with people passing the licenses to other street vendors or sharing a license at multiple locations. I think there needs to be something in that has a little more, that it's got to be very specific to either the individual or the location that they're going to street vend or whatever. Or on the flip side, then we maybe look at maybe deregulating some of our brick and mortar type businesses so that it's less expensive for them to open up, and then we get everybody into a brick and mortar.
If I could add something, excuse me, Mayor. I think those are all really good points. One thing that is really unique to our community that we've had to transition to is we've transitioned some of our code officers to do building inspections. So many of the public doesn't know, but our code enforcement officers wear multiple hats, and they're able to do building inspections as well. And so when we talk about prioritizing what are the elements of what the council prefers to see out in the community, those are the types of conversations that typically revolve around how much funding is allocated to doing a project or a program, and obviously the outcomes associated with that. So one of the challenges that we have, and I think this really dovetails with the conversation, which is another future agenda item, which has to do with Resolution 4703, which is the Measure U resolutions. And so there is a connection between quality of life and some may argue public safety with respect to some of these items. And so there is a really good nexus there. But on the staff side, I know our staff is extremely busy with the uptick in the number of inspections and the economic activity that's going on in our community. And so on a daily basis, we are transitioning our team to make sure that we're also taking care of the economic development side of expansion within our community. So that is a policy level issue that I think is a perfect time to have that conversation with respect to what it means, what are the inputs that are going into that, and then what do we expect on the backside, because obviously the staff can't be everywhere, and there are different priorities that get shifted throughout the day based on the issues that come up.
Do you have any more comments? Questions?
I just think we really need to look at the permitting and licensing and how that's done, but also really get into the nitty-gritty with code enforcement and police and the enforcement and checking. And weekends are a big deal for a lot, but I've been noticing lately that it's every day of the week. Not only the selling, the phones on Florida Avenue, but the flower vendors, the other item vendors, the food vendors that I'm getting calls on. Usually the question is, have you seen that new barbecue place that just popped up on the corner? Is it any good? And I'm going, why would you buy food from somebody that just pops up on a corner that you don't know? I mean, it makes no sense. It's like going to, and I'll say this because I've done it, going to Tijuana and buying tacos out of a hubcap.
Well, you know, it comes down to it. It's
And they're good.
if the food's good, people are going to go there
Yeah.
until somebody gets sick.
Well, and then what's the recourse? Then we get
Exactly.
into that. I'd rather do prevention and support our brick and mortar restaurants than anything else.
I appreciate your time. That's, we've got 15 minutes to spare, it looks like.
Yeah, just kind of an observation. I think we've probably all seen an uptick in the number of complaints that we're receiving from our constituents, and I think it's directly related to the state-imposed restrictions related to the pandemic. It's created kind of a perfect storm situation where the businesses that operate brick and mortar restaurants and food services are restricted, and that created an opportunity for the street vendors, and so we've seen an uptick in that, and so a lot of people who are concerned about the revenue picture and the impact that it is having, and their favorite restaurant possibly going out of business, while these street vendors are still thriving, apparently. I think if there are things that we can do to tighten up our ordinances, I think we need to do that. And I was going to put our police chief on the spot again, but he just stepped out. But just a thought for consideration. We have a good cadre of police volunteers, and they're granted the authority to issue citations for handicap parking violations. I think that could be a human resource available to check on these street vendors. If they went out and just had a checklist of things that they're required to have, they could go out and do those no notice. Hi, I'm here from the city. Do you have X, Y, and Z? If not, you're not allowed to operate. And if I think just that alone, not necessarily that we're putting them in an enforcement role, but just a resource to keep tabs on them. And it shows that we're doing something, that somebody's checking on them. And then if they had a situation where a particular vendor was lacking in any of the requirements, they could report that back, make a notation of it, and feed that back to code enforcement for the enforcement action. So there's, I wouldn't be opposed to them actually taking the enforcement action themselves, but at least I think we could use them as a resource for monitoring compliance.
I think there are some good points that were brought up by all the council members, and I think there were some details that Al touched upon that I think what makes sense is to allow the staff to formulate maybe a finer tuning of the items that have been conveyed by way of, displaying all the permits that are there, as Eric mentioned, and making sure that all of the items that are required of these individuals, and formulate conceptually what that might look like. And we can certainly do that. We can also include some information related to the building inspections that are also going along with code, so that the council can get an idea as to maybe that is a good tie-in with the conversations that I know the council's brought up before with Resolution 4703, and what are the options that we really have with that. If the council is okay with that, I think we can work with the Attorney's Office, Community Development, and really look at tidying up some of those parameters, looking at whether the volunteers are a suitable resource. I know that one thing we will want to be mindful about is our volunteers are a certain demographic, and so we wouldn't want them to get sick. And so we want to be mindful of COVID and anything like that related to our volunteers as well. But I think if the council is okay with that, we can go back, we can look at what the options are in tandem with legal, talk with our operations team and community development, and see what we can do to address some of the concerns that have been raised by the council, if that's okay with the council.
Well, I mean, I could see things like, and this is like way off my scope, but I can see things like maybe having code enforcement under law enforcement, because at some point there's got to be an enforcement element where they don't have to call the police necessarily, but they have the authority to do what they need to do. I mean, it can be like our CSOs or something.
Talked about that off and on for years.
Yeah,
And we
putting
need to code back
to do
the
something different.
police department and giving them more authority to do the enforcement process other than just the citing process, because citing doesn't work. I mean,
Right.
Unless it's such an extraordinary amount that, but then there also has to be something tied to that if they don't pay the citation or don't make the changes or corrections that's needed, that.
It's like the fireworks.
It's
Stick to $1,000.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a hurt.
Have to get the attention, and it is quality of life.
Well, I think we've gotten a good start. We've had some good discussion. We've given some good feedback. I think it was reassuring to know that we've already gone through and updated our municipal code to match up with the state. I won't comment whether or not I think the state law is a good thing or not, but I think we're off to a good start, and I think what you're suggesting, Chris, is a reasonable approach. I think there's still more work to be done, and I think there's some improvements that can be made. Okay, well, if there's nothing further, Al, thank you very much for the walk through the codes and the issues. And so we will adjourn our study session and convene at 7 o'clock for regular. Good evening. I'd like to call the October 27th, 2020 regular City Council meeting to order. I'd like to point out that this meeting is being hosted through live stream on the city's website and by teleconference for public comment. City staff is at an off-site location participating through video conference. If you're joining through teleconference, please remember to mute your phone to prevent noise interference until you provide your comments. Due to the structure of this meeting, I'd like to remind council to have their microphones turned on and positioned so the audience can hear. Deputy City Clerk, may I have a roll call, please?
Councilmember Meyer.
Here.
Councilmember Percival.
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Krupa.
Here.
Mayor Brown.
Here.
Thank you.
And tonight the invocation will be provided by Mary Rysdale with the Interfaith Council, after which Councilmember Meyer will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance. Please stand.
Good evening, and thank you. I'm going to divert from my usual reading of a single prayer and give you 3 sections from 3 separate writings, so the voice tense will be different. This first one is the words of Baha'u'llah. O befriended stranger, the candle of thine heart is lighted by the hand of my power. Quench it not with the contrary winds of self and passion. The healer of all thine ills is remembrance of me, forget it not. Make my love thy treasure, and cherish it even as thy very sight and life. This next one is written by the Bob. God sufficeth all things above all things, and nothing in the heavens or the earth but God sufficeth. Verily, he is in himself the knower, the sustainer, the omnipotent. And this last one is by Abdul Baha. Confirm this revered nation to upraise the standard of oneness of humanity, to promulgate the most great peace, to become thereby most glorious and praiseworthy among all the nations of the world. O God, this American nation is worthy of thy favors and is deserving of thy mercy. Make it precious and near to thee through thy bounty and bestowal. Amen.
Pledge to the American flag. Ready, begin.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it
like to be seated? Moving on to item 10, communications from the public. There's a temporary 2-minute per person time limit for all general public comments on non-public hearing items. All who wish to speak, including council members, need to be recognized by the mayor before speaking. Members of the public shall comply with adopted rules of decorum, Resolution 4545, a copy of which can be requested through the city clerk's office. You may also fill out a form and submit your comments online at www.hemetca.gov/councilchamberlive, and your comments will be read aloud. Submittal must be done, however, before 2 p.m. the day of the meeting. For those of you who wish to join by teleconferencing, you can join us by calling 888-585-9008, and when prompted, dial 768-176-038. You'll be asked to state your name prior to speaking. And a reminder, if you are joining by teleconference, please remember to mute your phone to prevent noise interference until your time to provide your comments. It's also requested that you remove yourself from other background noises at your location when providing comment by teleconference. Please remember to state your name and the item about which you are commenting before speaking. After the conclusion of communications from the public and the public hearing item, the public teleconference line will be deactivated. The public is still encouraged to watch the live stream at hemetca.gov/councilchamberlive. Item 10A is public comment for items listed on the agenda. City Clerk, are there any electronic comments submitted to be read aloud for consent or discussion items?
No, Mayor, there are no electronic comments submitted for those items.
And are there any members participating through the teleconference who would like to comment on consent or discussion items?
At this time, there are no members of the public on the line.
And do you have any speaker slips?
No requests to speak have been turned in.
Okay. Moving on to item 10B, public comment for items not listed on the agenda but within jurisdictional matter. City Clerk, were there any electronic comments submitted to be read aloud for non-agendized items?
Yes, Mayor, there were 2 electronic comments submitted. The first one is from Brian Bird. Subject is business protection from homeless or taggers. Comment states, we are business owners in town. We are picking up multiple times weekly from homeless and cleaning up graffiti from taggers. What is the city doing to help us protect our business? There seems to be an increasing number of incidents happening and we need help. End of comment. Next comment is from James Simon. Subject is property line setbacks. Comment is, I would like to have a patio cover built in my backyard, but code requires 15-foot setback. My house is 11.5 feet from rear property line. Most neighboring cities require 5 feet, and I was unable to find any requiring a 15-foot like Hemet. Would someone please explain to me why Hemet requires such a large setback and how the builder was able to build my house to begin with? In the comment, along with the public comment, was a attachment that was distributed to council. And that's the end of electronic comments.
City Manager, did you get a copy of this e-comment as well?
I got one of them, and I'm texting HP right now to make sure that he gets a copy of that from Clay. So I'm sending him a message right now.
So we can have staff follow up.
We'll follow up with the resident.
Thank you. Are there any members participating through teleconference that would like to comment on non-agendized items?
No public is on the conference line at this time.
Thank you. Do you have any speaker slips for non-agendized items?
Yes, there is one member of the public present, Marianne Derwin.
Welcome, Marianne.
I'll assume this is on. Good evening, Council. So I know you guys revamped your water bill. In the past couple months, I have been double charged on my water bill without my consent. It happened first in August, and I went ahead and I thought it was a mistake. I was charged $109 for my water bill. I called my bank. I had one of those charges reversed. I got a nice little letter from the guy who's in charge of the water department now, I'm not exactly sure who he was, telling me how much I owed and that I was late, and I called him back. Not a very pleasant man, was not really impressed with him, very rude to me. I told him I wanted a printout of my bill to see exactly why he was charging me $60 more than what I pay every month. I knew that there was a late fee on there. However, we figured that out. I just received my bill today, and you also charged me again for a charge that I did not advise. So it tells me that I paid my water bill, I paid $31 as the late fee, and then the next day you charged me another $31. Now, I look at my water bill, so I see what's going on. But that $31, fine, charge me the $31. But what about the people that are not looking at their water bill? And you're charging them, and you're charging on their account without even their permission. I didn't say he could charge my account $31 twice. Once on the 13th and then once on the 14th. And everybody here that lives in Hemet, as you know, everybody's on a budget. And so you charge $31, that could take away from something else. That could take away from somebody eating. So I'm really a little upset that I pay my bill online because you guys you request that you do it, paperless, pay your bill online, make it easier for everyone. But from now on, because you keep charging me without my consent, I'm going to start just getting a cashier's check and putting it in the mail. Because I shouldn't have to go through this frustration every single month wondering if you're going to go ahead and charge me double on my bill. So I was lucky to look at the $109 and see that and notice that that was missing. But what if somebody doesn't look? And then they just think they're short that money somehow. I don't know what the water company's doing. This is how I started coming here 4 years ago, and now I'm back to the same concern. So I really hope that you guys figure it out, that you're double charging people, and it's wrong. It's wrong when people are not paying attention. And that's partly their fault, but when I pay attention and I know what I'm paying and you're double charging me, it's wrong.
Thank you for sharing that circumstance, and I'm sure staff will follow up and look into that. Do we have any other public comment speaker slips?
No, Mayor, there are no other requests.
You are the only participant in this conference. Press any key to continue this conference.
Okay, well, we'll now move to presentations. Item 11A, it's my honor to share with you a little presentation that the City Council is happy to present to a woman named Polly McIntosh. She's a Hemet resident, and we're issuing this certificate of recognition to Polly in recognition of her 103rd birthday, which will be on October 30th. Ms. McIntosh has been a dedicated citizen in Hemet and for our community and her family, and the city's proud to have residents that cherish the community in which we live. The family is unable to be present at this meeting, but arrangements have been made to deliver this certificate to her, and we wish Polly a happy early birthday.
You are the only
with her
participant in
14
this conference.
grandchildren by her
Press
side.
any key to continue this conference.
And I would just like to make an observation that 103 years, just reflect on the things that have transpired in our lifetime. I can't even imagine what her experiences have been, just thinking about nothing other than transportation modes and the fact that we've landed men on the moon since all of that. So it's just quite an attainment to reach her 103rd birthday. So happy birthday, Polly, on behalf of the entire City Council. Item 11B is engineering update. And I believe we have a staff presentation, our city engineer.
So before Steve gets started, Mayor, wanted to provide a little bit of context here on mobile.
You are the only participant in this conference. Press any key to continue this conference.
You'll recall that we gave a similar presentation a couple of months ago with respect to community development and the economic development activity that was going on in our community. We're really happy to report back on some of the engineering highlights that are going on here. Over the last year, we've taken an aggressive stance on completing the CIP. Much of that had not been done previously, but we are taking a very aggressive stance on that. The council has approved almost every single one of these projects in the form of allocating contracts and approving agreements with the contractors that have provided this work. So collectively, the council has prioritized this by way of the action that they have taken on these projects. I should add that all of the kudos goes to the engineering team, and as well as Steve, as well as the rest of the staff that we have in-house. They've taken a very active approach in managing these projects, a very active approach in making sure that these projects get completed, and making sure that every aspect of the project is finalized and completed and all the inspections are completed. And so I just want to take some time to briefly recognize the folks that we have in engineering. They've done an incredible job. Steve has done an incredible job, and HR Green has done an incredible job in bringing forward the accomplishments that we have for you tonight. So thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Chris. Over to you, Steve.
Good evening, Mayor, members of the council. City Manager Lopez, thank you very much for the information, but without you and without the council, we really couldn't be here doing this. So thank you all. As the city manager mentioned, we're just going to provide some engineering highlights. Now, before this really gets kicked off and gets exciting, it's not as glorious as development review. So community development does a way better job at this, but we'll show you some of the cool stuff though. So our objective, this is kind of our objective from HR Green standpoint, but it also mends well with the engineering department that we work closely with. What our purpose is from an HR Green standpoint of going into any city, we try to understand the vision of what the city has in mind as well as determining the goals. All we're doing is providing the technical expertise to get those goals accomplished. In Hemet, it's a little different though, because we're fulfilling a role.
I'm sorry, that's just funny. Everything's a little different in Hemet.
It's not different in a bad way. It's a bit different because we're fulfilling a role that capacity.
We own it. It's okay.
I'm sorry?
We own it. It's okay.
Well, you just got me off my rock now.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I honestly, I do appreciate it when you laugh because it means that we're all human. So, what we're trying to do is really fill the need to expand the capacity that's been lacking, and by helping fulfill that void, we're getting a lot more stuff done. See, as I mentioned, it's not as cool looking as what community development has. You know, you got a story manhole here, but some of the scope of work that we're doing, this all falls within the engineering side of it. Okay, just making sure. The first one is the ADA improvements, where there's been a couple projects we've done in recent time to enhance the curb ramps as well as missing sidewalk pieces. Private development, working with community development on that. Street maintenance, hopefully you've seen and noticed there's been a lot more road work done just in the last year and a half. And then sewer main rehabilitation, we've been working with Public Works on that. So one of the projects just to highlight is the missing link ADA sidewalk repair. As I mentioned, you know, the curb ramps are a big thing. It goes unnoticed, really, until you start digging everything out. Those curb ramps make a difference for a lot of the community, especially the community that has a lot of wheelchair-bound citizens. Just some other stuff. We get the signs put up there as well. Kirby Street was a big one here. You can see beforehand it was kind of just there. It looks a lot better now. We've got the striping that's enhanced. That's reminding people again. In fact, we worked with just Public Works recently in setting up an on-call, an annual on-call for striping maintenance. And that's something that's important. It's just the simple things that need to be addressed by sometimes adding some striping that hasn't been touched up in a while. So here are just some other pictures regarding the slurry seal. It enhances the street. I shouldn't just say it enhances the street. It actually protects the street. We take the slurry seal and we put those on streets that are still close to being alive. If we wait too long, there's no purpose of putting the slurry seal on. The slurry seal enhances that longevity of that street. Now, the picture here, it's important to understand, okay, the slurry seal afterwards looks really good, but the purpose on the left is that we actually do some major maintenance before we put the slurry seal down. Some of this stuff, we grind it out and then we can put some asphalt in there to make sure that the cracks don't come up to the surface as quick. Some of the other projects that we've been working on in the last year and a half, a little over a year and a half, the Warren Auto Boulevard traffic signal. We talked about some of the missing link sidewalk repairs. There was 2 years worth of work. We've got phases 1 and 2 of the pavement rehabilitation, and then the other one's for slurry seal. You'll notice that there's a couple different years in here. In fact, right now we're actually starting a 17-18 slurry seal project. Just the way the funds were allocated, so we'll make sure we're still getting those done. This is an interesting slide. Erica Murphy was actually the one helping me out with this. I never thought I'd say that I'm a little technically back sometimes, but I'm admitting it. This is just a picture of all the different locations throughout the entire city that we've done in the last year and a half with the blessing of the council to get those streets done, whether it's slurry seal or pavement rehabilitation. Some of them had the curb ramps, some of them had sidewalk, but this is just really to kind of give you an idea of where it's been touched, and we try to really spread it throughout the city. This is the cool part. So 54 centerline miles of pavement rehabilitation completed. That's just in a year and a half. 18 centerline miles planned that we have coming up still. And obviously, if you add up all that stuff, it's $6.5 million, $6.6 million that we've accomplished just in this last year and a half. And that has been, it's been such a great thing to do, because not only did we work with the engineering department, but we worked with Public Works and Finance. Finance really has a big portion of this, that without them, we couldn't get these projects out on the street.
Let me add something here too. Are you going to get into some of the other projects we've done, including the EVPs along Florida, or some of the other projects that we've done coming up later in your presentation?
We do have other projects coming up, yes, but I didn't have the EVP on there because I didn't get finalized yet, but it's there. So
mention that in here.
Okay. I can read the screen, but I'll just kind of highlight some of the cool ones that we have here. The Esplanade widening, Warren to Sanderson. That's something that I'll be coming back to council with hopefully very, very soon. The WRCOG, the TUMP program, actually allocated some funds for the city to do some of the work on the south side. I think I might have come back and spoken with you in the past about it, but that's really a cool one. And all we've got to do now is just take it to council to get the authorization to kind of move forward with that.
And is that being done in conjunction with San Jacinto? Is there widening on their side?
Yeah.
Okay.
And everything is still kind of on hold because EMWD is coming through with a portion in that area. The fourth bullet down, talking about the pavement management program. So one was done back in 2014, 2015, and we try to make sure that in the perfect world we would update it every year, and that's just kind of a windshield survey. We drive the streets, take a look, see what's going on. But there's a program that we're working on now that actually will do a very intensive update at first, And then on a yearly basis, the computer program really works to kind of give us a guide for however many years you want. It depends on how much money you want to spend, what the condition of the street that you want to have in 5 to 7 years. So it's a more robust program. It's not scary to use, though. So that's what I like. The treatment at the wells 15 and 16, working with Public Works to get an RFP out for that. And the various pavement rehabilitation and slurry seal projects. That's ongoing. Every year there's money we set aside for specifically, in fact, SB1, the RMRA Senate bill that came through the other year. So that money goes straight to the slurry seal and pavement rehabilitation projects. This is the precursor to some of the development projects that are going on. One thing that, when I started here a little over a year and a half ago, I had heard that there hasn't been a lot of development. And then earlier in this year, starting really to work a lot with HP, and then prior to that, Nelson Miller, hearing that there was about 40 units in the last year or so. There wasn't very many. And then now, just in this last year and a half, to see all these come online, it really is, it's amazing to see that things are I'm positive about it because things are turning around. McSweeney Farms has come back online. I've talked with council in the past about McSweeney Farms and the bond measures. We've got 3 home builders. No, I know I've got 2 home builders on track with that. That's 33824-1 and 33824-2. So that's 160 homes right there. There's another tract right adjacent to that. It's about another 50 homes that another home builder is looking at. Came back and spoke with council a couple months ago about the River Oaks development. That's another 300 units that are coming online. We're working with the home builders along with community development to try to get these plans looked at and approved so they can start grading. The second one down is Rancho Diamante master plan area. That one you may have seen off of Warren and Mustang. Some rough grading has already been accomplished out there, and they're moving forward with working on the revision to the map, and that'll be coming up soon. So they're going to start doing regular grading and working on that side.
I ask you a question about that project area. Is there any likelihood that the action that was taken to put the curve in the road where there really isn't a needed curve of Warren, is there any likelihood that that can be addressed along with this project?
I would like to say yes, but unfortunately, no. It's a cost thing because of it's an environmental cost thing. When that road was realigned, it was realigned because of the environmentally sensitive area that was in that portion. It was just on the west side of Warren. So that's what the curve was for. Now, there will be some adjustments made on the north end of Warren, where that's on the west side of Warren, towards the north end, just before the railroad tracks. That's where a commercial development is planned. And there'll be some enhancements out there to the intersection. However, the curve will not be flattened out.
There's no way that we can...
Oh, sure. There's a way. It's getting through the environmental aspects of things.
I would just like to see us explore every possibility that is at our disposal to try to address that. I understand the reason why, and I won't go into my soapbox editorial.
That road was straight for over 100 years, and those damn fairy shrimps survived. Now, all of a sudden, they need extra space? That's crazy. People's lives are at risk because of that curve, and we need to fix it.
I never heard about fairy shrimp until about a year and a half ago. I didn't know those things existed. So it's something that I will look into.
Take care of it with RCA. Aren't you still on RCA? Okay.
I didn't mean to derail your presentation.
No, that's fine.
I just think that's an area that we hear about all the time, and I think we all have pretty strong feelings that it needs to be addressed in some fashion, that for the environmentalists to put the fairy shrimp survivability as a higher priority than traffic safety, to me is backwards. No. Yeah.
But
I only got on my little soapbox. Okay.
It's a very good point.
Please continue.
I will look into that, and I will report back to the city manager the history of that and seeing what there is the possibility. Just on, not a soapbox, but just on offshoot, the issue that we have here in the community is the flatlands. And wherever water kind of manages to migrate to, that's where the water stays, and it ends up becoming, the wetlands are environmentally sensitive. So,
It was fertile farmland 500 years before the fairy shrimp were discovered.
Okay, like I said, I didn't mean to derail your presentation, but just for future consideration.
Understood, and I will report back. Here's continuing on some of the development projects. McSweeney Farms, as we talked about, and then Stony Mountain. Stony Mountain's off of Warren and Esplanade. So I bring that one up because that one came to life again in the last year. A couple more maps have been recorded, and that has been an important part as we move forward with the widening of Esplanade as well. So some of the other development projects I just wanted to throw out there. One I spoke with about in the past was Zanderson. These are commercial development, by the way. Zanderson Plaza, which has a gas station and a couple other offices and businesses around there. This one's kind of cool. Raising Cane's. I've been to one, but you wait in line forever.
When are they going to start building?